when we do look into the narrations in Sunni Islam, the first-hand testimonies of these individuals that were close to the Prophet Muhammad in Sunni Islam, we find that they're actually agreeing that the Quran was in fact corrupted, and that the Quran that we have today is not the same Quran that the Prophet Muhammad delivered. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد الأم المهديين وسلم تسليما. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
So, Dr. Irfan, today we're going to talk about a very controversial topic, and that is the topic of the corruption of the Quran, and whether or not the Quran is preserved. And it is a very touchy topic, and it's a touchy topic because the general belief that most Muslims around the world hold, whether they're Sunni or they're Shia, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the final messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa Muhammad was given the Quran. The Quran is the final revelation of God. There's no more books or revelations that are coming after that. And so for that reason, it has to endure the test of time and remain preserved. And there are verses in the Quran, like, verily we are the ones who brought down the remembrance, and verily we are protectors or guardians of it. These verses are understood by the Muslims to be a divine promise from God that He will guard the Quran so that it can never be tainted or go away, unlike some of the other books that have been given to previous prophets and messengers, such as the Torah or the Injil, the Gospels, that were each and every one of them corrupted by the hands of man after the passing of the prophets and the messengers. This belief that books that were given to prophets and messengers were corrupted after the prophets and messengers by the followers of those religions or by enemies that had infiltrated those religions is the main reason why Muslims reject the books and refuse to read or take from the ideas that are in the Old Testament or the New Testament because of the Quran stating that there were people that had written the revelation with their own hands or corrupted it, and narrations from the Prophet Muhammad that stated that there were enemies of Christianity and Judaism that forged verses or corrupted the texts. And Muslims recognize that there are differences in the historical narratives that are present in the Quran that contradict the accounts that are in the Gospels and in the Old Testament, and that's okay for Muslims because they believe that naturally any contradiction between the Quran and between the Bible is due to the fact that the Bible, whether the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, was corrupted by people. So there's many different ways that a text could be corrupted. It could be corrupted in its interpretation, and certainly they believe that the priests and the rabbis have corrupted the meanings of the verses by twisting the interpretations and giving meanings to them that it doesn't have. And they also believe that there were verses in these texts that were taken out or added into it. So just, sections or books that were altogether made up, or verses that were made up and placed in there in order to, for example, make it out to be that Jesus was crucified, or that he died for the sins of humanity, or that he is the Son of God. And Christians and Muslims, they debate a lot surrounding this. And Christians also attack Muslims by trying to find contradictions or mistakes in the Quran, or make the case that the Quran also is corrupted, and it's not a real divine book, or it has in there mistakes.
Yes, this topic is indeed controversial, and growing up you learn straight off the bat that the Quran is the holy preserved word of God, and every single letter is exactly as it descended on the Prophet in his heart through the angel Gabriel, and this is not to be questioned in any way, shape or form, and it is because God himself is the guardian, because it says so in the Quran that God is the guardian over this book.
So now we need to look at what the books of the Muslims state about this topic, to see whether or not what the Muslims believe is true or not true. And when we do look into the narrations in Sunni Islam and the hadiths that are the sayings and the statements that were made by the companions, the first-hand testimonies of these individuals that were close to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Sunni Islam, we find that they're actually agreeing that the Quran was in fact corrupted, and that the Quran that we have today is not the same Quran that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam delivered, and that there are things that are missing from it. And we have narrations that are in the Sahih books, in Sahih Muslim and other Sahih books of the Sunni Muslims, that state basically that there were verses. For example, Aisha talks about a verse from the Quran that used to be a part of the Quran that came down on the Prophet Muhammad but is no longer there, and that it was a verse that was pertaining to the breastfeeding of adults, and this one she had it written on a piece of paper, and it was eaten by a goat. Because she had hid it underneath her bed, and a goat came across it and ate it. And so therefore there were verses, Aisha says, that are missing from the Quran. Mm-hmm. This is her testimony.
That's a huge testimony.
And she says also pertaining to stoning, and that's something which Umar ibn Khattab himself, the second caliph of the Muslims, the second of the so-called rightly guided caliphs for Sunni Islam, and they believe that these guys were, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, that they had divine enforcement, and therefore, they didn't make mistakes. And Umar also states that, that there were verses that he remembers from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, a verse that had to do in particular with stoning, and that this verse is no longer there, and that if it was there, then he would have surely implemented stoning as a capital punishment. So this is huge, because you have these two individuals that are really close to the Prophet. One of them is the close companion, and the other one, which is the Prophet's wife, and both of them are testifying to this fact. And it's in the Sahih, Sunni book of narrations.
Abdullah ibn Abbas reported that Umar bin Khattab sat on the pulpit of Allah's Messenger and said, "Verily, Allah sent Muhammad, peace be upon him, with the truth, and he sent down the book upon him, and the verse of stoning was included in what was sent down to him. We recited it, retained it in our memory, and understood it. Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, awarded the punishment of stoning to death to the married adulterer and adulteress. And after him, we also awarded the punishment of stoning. I am afraid that with the lapse of time, the people may forget it and may say, we do not find the punishment of stoning in the book of Allah, and thus go astray by abandoning this duty prescribed by Allah. Stoning is a duty laid down in Allah's book for married men and women who commit adultery when proof is established, or if there is pregnancy or a confession. It was narrated that Aisha said, no doubt, the verse of stoning and the breastfeeding of adults by 10 sucklings was revealed, and it was on a paper below my bedding. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, died, and we were busy, a goat entered and ate it.
Then you have companions of the Prophet that were narrators, reciters, memorizers of the Quran, and they testify that there were complete surahs that are missing, or there are surahs in the Quran that were 2 to 3 times larger, but it didn't make it into the Quran, and they specifically recite in writing, it's written, verses that they remember from these missing parts. And one of them that's mentioned is a verse that states that nothing fills the belly of the Son of Man except for dust. And so this verse is not currently in the Quran, but the companions of the Prophet are swearing that it used to be, it was a verse that they would recite with the Prophet, and that the Prophet would recite, and it's one of those verses that existed in his time. And so the Muslim history preserves and narrates the fact that the Quran during the time of the Prophet Muhammad was not compiled by him. It was basically the Prophet was reciting, and he had scribes, and the scribes preserved in writing the different surahs and the different verses, but they were not compiled together. So there maybe one scribe wrote 10 verses from Surah Al-Baqarah, and another scribe wrote 20, and another one wrote 30, and it was only after the death of the Prophet Muhammad that the companions got together and they said, hey, we need to do something in order to, compile this book together. And so they called forward all of the Muslims, and they had everybody who had written down a surah from the Quran or anything from the Quran, they made them bring that forward, and then they together decided on the arrangement in what is known now as the Uthmani version of the Quran that was compiled finally in the time of Uthman ibn Affan, 12 years after the Prophet's death. And in it, the Muslims arranged the surahs and arranged the verses that are in the surahs according to how they best remembered the Prophet having recited them.
Wow. It's absolutely stunning to hear the fact that such prominent figures as Umar bin al-Khattab and Aisha are opening the mind to the notion that the Quran could perhaps not be the complete and incorruptible word of God. I mean, that certainly opens the door when they're saying that we remember there were verses such as the ones you mentioned that were part of the original revelation, and now they're not. And Umar bin al-Khattab saying that he wished that he could put this into practice because then it would be in the Quran. So this is absolutely amazing to hear. And I think a lot of Sunni audience will hear it and be shocked, but yet they say that Umar bin al-Khattab is a second rightly guided caliph, and he is saying these words.
Yes, he is. And shocked or not shocked, this is what's in their books.
Right.
So what shall we do? It's not stuff that we're making up. So you have that, and then you have in Shia Islam narrations from the household of the Prophet Muhammad that are validating what is in the Sunni books. And they state basically that after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, the Prophet had given before he died the task to Imam Ali alayhi salam to preserve the Quran and to compile it and to write a version of the Quran that was perfect and free from any corruption. And that Ali ibn Abi Talib had with him every single verse of the Quran that was reviewed by the Prophet Muhammad before his passing. And so for the 6 months after his death, it states, the narration state that Imam Ali stayed in his house, and during the time that he stayed in his house, he compiled that Quran in its perfect form, and that it was much bigger than the version that the general Muslim population had. And when he was completed with it, and so it had all the verses, all the surahs, and it had in there the interpretation of the verses in the surahs. Imam Ali took that book and he presented it to the Abu Bakr and Umar, and they refused to take it, and they said, no, what we have is enough, and they proceeded to compile their own version. And so Imam Ali, who was extremely offended and perceived this to be an act of disbelief, really, he tells them that, okay, you nation that has turned its back after the passing of the Prophet, this version of the Quran, by Allah, you will never then see again until it is brought forward by the Qaim, by the Mahdi. So this notion is present in many of the Shia narrations, that there is another version of the Quran, and that the companions did compile one, but the one that they compiled was incomplete and full of verses that were mismatched and misplaced, and it has corruptions in it, and recitations even that were wrong, or words in there that were perhaps pronounced wrong, or even that weren't even there on the tongue of the Prophet Muhammad. And this other version of the Quran that Imam Ali had is the fulfillment of the promise of God that he would preserve the Quran, but he preserves it through a divine imam in every day and age. So the idea that the Shia have is that religion is preserved, but through a man, and that the man has the true Quran, and that man was Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, and then the Quran went to his son Imam al-Hassan, and then it was with Imam al-Hussein, and all the way passed from one imam to one imam until this current day and age, where the Qaim will bring it forward, and his companions will even teach, according to one narration, in Al-Kufa, the non-Arab companions of the Qaim will teach the Arab companions the Quran as it really came down. And the idea behind it is that the Arab companions, the Arab believers in this day and age are unable to handle this. It is too difficult and too hard for them to believe that there's a new version of the Quran, but in reality, it's not a new version. It is the original version, the original Quran that came down on Muhammad, but because of the past 1400 years, the people believing and holding on so tight to that version of the Quran, that this version of the Quran will be the most difficult thing for somebody who has memorized the old Quran to memorize this version of the Quran, because their heart is unable to accept that. And that's why the hadiths of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam have also stated that the Qaim comes with a new matter and a new book, and he returns Islam back to its original form. So we have now Sunni Islam and Shia Islam both verifying this idea or notion that the current Quran that the people have is not free of corruption, but that there is this Quran that, in the case of Sunni Islam, existed in the time of the Prophet, but no longer does now, because the people forgot those verses. And in Shia Islam, no, that original version of the Quran still exists today, but it only exists with the household of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so now we have to examine these statements and see what it is that we should believe. Should we believe the hadiths from Sunni and Shia Islam and the eyewitness testimonies of the companions of the Prophet and the family of the Prophet and the people that were living with him at that time? Or should we believe the scholars that were born and came 1,400 years after the Prophet that are telling us that the Quran is free of any sort of corruption?
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear the Shia version of events closely parallel what the Sunnis believe, and the matter is such that it's a heavy matter, it's a dangerous topic to discuss, and that's why you don't hear it first off, that the Shia also believe that, they clearly do mention that the Imam Ali had another version of the Quran, but when you initially talk to them, they're kind of guarded about this issue, but it says very clearly that the Imam Ali has the true version of the Quran, and it was preserved in the line of the Imams from the family of the Prophet.
Yeah, and it's not just Shia, Shia people that, and by the way, most of the Shia people, they believe that there's only one Quran, and it's the Quran that's here, just like the majority of the Sunni population. It's just those who are learned, those who know the narrations, they believe that, no, this Quran is not the true Quran. The true one's with Imam Ali. And also learned scholars of Sunni Islam, although few, they do also believe and would validate what I'm saying. And anybody could validate what I'm saying by just going to the Sahih Hadith. But you have these other scholars that have kind of, they just disregard this notion and they continue to claim that there's only one copy of the Quran. So now what we have to do is, I think we have to do a little bit of experimentation and research for our own selves, and in order to prove to the viewers that what the companions and what the family of the Prophet was saying was true. We're going to turn their attention to the screens now, where we're going to be placing on the screens side by side these two different versions of the Quran that you can find being sold until this very day in the Muslim countries, and you can order it. Anybody can order these versions of the Quran online. So there's a version of the Quran that is by Hafs, and there's a version of the Quran that's by Warsh. And these two versions of the Quran, when you put them side by side, you will see that there are stunning differences in the verses, in not just one location, but in many locations, and in the letters. And there's even words such as "and" that are missing from one version to another. And there's even a particular verse that is very much different than the one that's in the other one. And so what are these versions of Hafs and Warsh? Basically, in the time of the Prophet, in the narrations, it states that there were several different ways that the Prophet, when he was reciting the Quran, that he would recite it. So sometimes he would pronounce the words in a certain way, and in other instances, he would pronounce them in a different way. And these became known as the different readings of the Quran. So, and this is generally accepted by all Muslims, that there's different ways to recite it. And you have instances, and you have recordings even of famous reciters such as Abdul Basit, Abdul Samad, and Minshawi or Al-Husari, that when they are reciting the Quran, they would repeat the verse 2 to 3 times, each time pronouncing or enunciating the words in a different way, in order that they make multiple readings, recitations in the same recording that they were having. And so there's different ways to recite. But what most people don't know is that there was actually writings and versions of the Quran that were also different. And so these famous reciters of the Quran, Hafs and Warsh, they each one of them, there was a Quran that was written according to their recitation, and in one person's recitation to the other, words would have a different meaning, or there would be missing letters or differences in the writings itself. Yeah, so that's quite shocking, I think, to most Muslims. And now we've proven that this idea that there is only one version of the Quran that's available in the world that is the same. It's just one uniform text that down to every single fatha, damma, kasra, every single letter, every single hamza, that it is the same. It's not. Now we have multiple versions of the Quran that you can have access to even today, which further proves the claims and the case that the companions were making, that there is things that are missing from the Quran. Because if it was from God, it would be only one. But because there are multiple versions, so one of the versions there has to be a human influence at the very least.
Yes, fascinating. And Al-Sadiq, you spoke about the Abu Bakr and Umar, and I think if we just go a little bit forward, the Sunni kind of books of history record this event with Uthman bin Affan, as he noticed the Islamic empire growing and new converts from different nations going. There was a concerted effort by him to try and have one uniform version of the Quran, which he had written by certain scribes and then disseminated to Damascus, Kufa, and Basra. And the idea was that you would get all of these alternate versions and burn them, so that they would be in the name of not having confusion and to have unity. And actually, they also document that, particularly in Kufa, people were reluctant and resisting this move to burn the alternate versions of the Quran. So even history kind of documents this, what you're saying. And I think anybody who has time can look this up very easily. It's not something that's contested by the Sunnis.
There are people that have pointed out that in the Quran there are huge mistakes and contradictions. And the enemies of Islam, or the people that are trying to debunk Islam as a religion altogether, will use these historical inaccuracies or fallacies as proof that the Quran is not from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the response would always be from the Muslims that it's your books that are corrupt, the Gospels and the Torah, and for that reason, you're seeing inconsistencies or historical inaccuracies. It's from you guys. It's not from us. But if we take seriously the narrations that are present in Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, and we assume that, okay, well, these companions, they compiled the Quran in a way after the Prophet died that they themselves were even unsure of, and they themselves are claiming that there was things that were missing from, then we have to consider that maybe if their words are true, then the historical inaccuracies, the fault is the fault of the Quran, that the Quran actually is the one that has historical inaccuracies in it due to their compilation of the Quran, not because Islam is not from God, and also not because it is necessarily fixing something that was wrong in the Torah or in the Gospels. And so some of these examples of the contradictions or historical inaccuracies is the story of Gideon and Saul in the Quran. So in the Old Testament, there is the story of a king who is named Saul, and he's living in the time of Samuel, and this is in the time of King David, and they're all existing at the same time period. And the Israelites had went to this prophet, and they asked him to have God appoint over them a king. And so he appoints for them Saul, and Saul was taller than the rest of the Israelites, and he was such a good-looking individual, the Old Testament says, and very smart. Okay?
All right.
And then over here in the Quran, you have a story about the Israelites going to a prophet, and they're asking that prophet, although his name is missing, and it's Samuel, they ask him to appoint over them a king.
Right.
And then it says, and so God appointed over them Talut. And Talut, in the Quran, they say that God, he gave him great figure and great knowledge. So the description of Talut is the same description as Saul. All right, although Saul in the Arabic version of the Bible is Shaul and not Talut, but nonetheless, the description of Talut is the same as the description of Saul. And the incident of the Israelites asking their prophet, over here it's the same as the Israelites asking Samuel, so it's clearly the same story, except that the story of Talut continues on, and he ends up having an army of his that have to cross over this river, and they're giving the command not to drink from the river.
Right.
They're tested and tried with drinking from the river, and whoever drinks from it is not from him, and they fail, and whoever only drinks from it, whoever drinks from it fails, and whoever drinks from it a little bit is okay, but whoever abstains from it, these are the winners. And we have that same story in the Old Testament, but it's not about Saul. It's about another prophet in another time period whose name is Gideon.
Okay.
He's actually one of the judges of the Israelites who lives way before the time of Saul.
Right.
And so it's the Quran now has taken the story of Gideon and his soldiers crossing the river and the story of Saul and meshed them together as if they were one person in the person and in the narrative of the story of Talut. So this is a problem. Right. Another problem is the historical discrepancy between the Quranic narrative and the Judaic Christian narrative is the narrative and the story of Pharaoh and Moses. In there, you have Pharaoh in the Quran having a sidekick who's called Haman, and Haman is telling him, giving Pharaoh advice, and Pharaoh asks Haman to build this great tower so that he can go up and peek on the God of Moses. Except that in the Old Testament, Pharaoh doesn't build this tower to look at the God of Moses. The tower that's built is the Tower of Babylon. And Pharaoh in the Old Testament doesn't have a sidekick called Haman. Haman is a different character that appears in a different time period in a different country in the Old Testament. So Haman is in the Old Testament, but he's existing somewhere else.
So the name Haman is there.
He's there, but he's just a totally different character in a different story that has to do with different people in a different country, speaking a different language than what's taking place with Pharaoh in the time of Moses in Egypt. So this is a very big problem. Another historical discrepancy between the two is this idea that Mary, the mother of Jesus, has a brother. She's referred to in a verse in the Quran as the sister of Aaron. When they're talking to her, they're like, "Oh, sister of Aaron." And it's talking about Mary in the context of the story of Mary, mother of Christ.
Right.
Except that in the Old Testament, Mary doesn't have a brother called Aaron, but there's another Miriam, because over here in the Quran, Mary in Arabic is Maryam,
Right.
And over here, there's Mary, mother of Christ, but there's also Miriam, who is the sister of Aaron and the sister of Moses.
Right.
All right. And so she's a famous Miriam that has a brother called Aaron. But over here, what the Quran seems to do is to confuse these two stories, characters, and mesh them together.
And the Gospels of, I think there's no mention in the Gospels of her having a brother, Mary.
No.
Aaron. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. So, in the apparent, if you're looking at a non-biased look without, putting in there your own beliefs or feeling sensitive by it, if you're examining it, as a truth seeker, you will automatically come to, one of a couple different conclusions. First conclusion, as a historian, you would say, this version of the story is older, and in all historians will take the older version as the original. So if you have an Egyptologist and we have one, Hadil's father, Salah, and we've discussed how it is that these Egyptologists they determine what is the factual story. When they're examining different historical narratives or stories that are appearing in different time periods in ancient Egypt. And he states that obviously the older one is the original one.
Right.
So the older you go back, the more that you believe in it and you accept it as the original. And anything that contradicts that later on in history, they don't see it as a correction. They see it as like the details got lost throughout time, so the story became corrupted. Kind of like that game that children play when they whisper something in the ear of the Chinese whispers, and then by the time it gets all the way around the circle, it becomes something else. So if you're going to look at it scientifically speaking, then the Old Testament and the New Testament, are the sources that are true and accurate. And the Quran was obviously then Muhammad's not a prophet, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi had gotten his facts wrong when he was writing the Quran. He just he didn't know anything, and the people that he was preaching to also they didn't know anything, so it kind of worked.
Right.
Or if you're going to accept the fact that what the companions testified to and the household of the Prophet testified to, that there was corruptions in the Quran and that it was compiled by humans after the Prophet left, and they arranged things according to how they saw fit or how they remembered it, and we leave this door open to the possibility of human corruption and interference in the Quran. If we accept that, then this becomes a very natural thing that we can accept. And if one day the original Quran comes with the Qaim and it corrects the idea and it says, actually, no, that verse was misplaced. Or that verse it was talking about, it was a verse that came in a different place, and it was talking about Maryam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, and not talking about Mary, the mother of Jesus, but the companions, they didn't know any better, so they took that verse from here and they put it over here. Then in that context, it would make sense, and if we believe that narrative, it would make sense that the Qaim will come and correct some of these things.
Wow. How can you not be open to this notion that, in the context of what you've said, that this is a possibility? It's a very real possibility, and I think people who study history, with the source evidence that you said, with the original source being the most authentic or strongest, and the more recent ones less reliable, then you have to at least be open to that idea.
Yeah, well, it's only one of three explanations. It's either there is some corruption in the Quran, and this is why these inconsistencies are there, or it is the fact that the Bible and the Torah had it wrong, and the Quran has it right on every single one, and so Mary did have a brother called Aaron, and you know, Haman did live with Pharaoh, and you know, that the Jews just they split the character of Saul and they made him into a new character and made up Gideon, and
seems absurd, doesn't it?
and they made up a whole new story about Haman somewhere else, and they took him away from Pharaoh and they put him over there. So it's you know, it's either that the Bible's right or the Quran's right, or that the Quran is right, but it's preserved with its family, with its household, because the Muslims rejected it, and so the version that we have now, it's not the complete, authentic, incorrupt version. And I think that is the likely explanation, and that's where all of the evidence is pointing to, and that's what gathers all of these narratives together, and that's what is acceptable, even logically speaking. You have inaccuracies, okay, contradictions. Where are they coming from? Well, at least some of them are coming from where the companions and the household of the Prophet are telling us that they came from, and they came from the Muslims who did not know the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they were basically in a power struggle after the death of the Prophet, and they compiled it as they wished to compile it. But yet God will preserve the Quran, and has preserved the Quran, and will bring forward the Quran in its pure form in the time of the Quran.
Can't wait for that time. Fascinating.
Well, God bless you, Dr. Hafs.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for joining me, and we look forward to hearing what our viewers have to say about that.
I'm sure we'll get a huge number of comments, but it's good. At least they'll open to the idea. Very compelling evidence. Thank you.
Thank you.